start the recording.
Please go ahead and record if you would.
I've got it.
Okay.
All right. We have a guest speaker, which you'll hear in just a moment. A couple quick announcements before we get going. Remember that course evaluations are due by Sunday. That's the next Sunday, is 7 days from now. Be sure to do it for all your classes. And I'm happy to say that 71% of the students in this class have done it, which is a pretty good return. And remember that you're evaluating the evil Dr. Williams, not the ever kind and forgiving Dr. Yuan. So score accordingly. There is one more assignment due in this class, due tomorrow by noon. And I understand, of course, that it's not tomorrow at 11:30, but a number of you have not submitted the questions. We want 4 questions that are suitable for the final exam, questions that would be appropriate for the final exam. Now, they ought to be good questions. A good, I put a link there to Wikipedia or someplace to look at Bloom's taxonomy. Bloom's taxonomy is a teaching set of rules. It talks about different levels of learning. This is a graduate class. Don't ask memorization questions. Bloom says several, and I want things at the application level or above. So go out and take a look. It'll only take you 60 seconds to look at Bloom's taxonomy. Take a look and see what its application level and above are. Also remember that this is an open book test. That means if I can Google the question and find the answer in 30 seconds or less, then it's just not an appropriate question. So please come up with 4 good questions. This is not as easy as you might think. Yes, you probably think that the faculty do nothing, just randomly make up these questions. And sometimes we do, but yes, you have to think of a good question. It has to be related to the topic, neither trivial nor incredibly difficult. Not a memorization question, but something preferably that has you do something with the information that you've learned in the course. Okay, and if you ask a really good question, I might put it on the final exam. And hopefully, if you ask a really good question, you'd be smart enough to know the answer. Okay, so please remember to get that done. Okay, our guest speaker today is Kristen Bell. She's with GuidePoint Security. She's been in the security business since 2005. Now, I might point out that your instructor has been doing security since, the 1970s or so, which is a heck of a long time ago. But I've been busy doing a couple other things in between. So she's probably stuck to the application security area. And she's done that application security, database security reviews, and assortment other asks. So I will let Ms. Bell take over from here. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I am going to attempt to share my slides. And it looks like, are we seeing the right one?
Yes, we're seeing your slides. Thank you.
Awesome. So thank you all so much for having me. I've been really excited about this. I love doing things to help enhance it and grow our workforce. We're very application security is especially hot right now. And so there's a lot more jobs than there are people to fill them, which we'll get around to later because I'll give you a little pep talk and hopefully you'll find this interesting enough that maybe GuidePoint might look like a place that you might want to come to work at when you get done with your education. But that being said, I sort of recycled this title of this talk from a talk I did extensively over COVID because I didn't have to travel. So I was asked to speak at a lot of different conferences and events and OAuth chapter meetings, ISSA meetings, and things like that along the way. And I thought it would be nice to kind of give you all, since your course is really about the mechanics of security and software testing, to give you some applicable real world scenarios and sort of how you might use this knowledge and apply it to your future within the field. And so I wanted to kind of do that and give you a sense of how things have changed over the years. I've been doing application security a long time. I'll on the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about my history in the industry, but to also kind of maybe inspire you a little bit as far as when you're thinking about what you want to do with this information. And that's really where the rubber meets the road, right? So the reason I called it raising the AppSec bar is I think we've seen a huge change in the evolution of application security over the years, and we'll talk about that a couple of slides from now. I also called it Beyond SAM. So I know you all are probably very familiar with the OAuth top 10, but if you can just click your raise hand buttons and show me, is anybody familiar with the software assurance maturity model that is the SAM? Is that a familiar concept? I'm seeing Dr. Williams shaking his head and I'm not seeing any raised hands. So one of the things that's really important to know about the software, about OWASP in general, is that it's a treasure trove of information. It's really not limited to just the OWASP top 10. There's all kinds of cheat sheets and, there's testing guides, which I'm sure you probably have explored in this class and maybe other classes. But there's also some strategy and architecture and design concepts and projects that are in there. And software assurance maturity model is a big one. So it is now in version 2.0. The original version was great. It was fabulous. It's there are a few things I really like about it. I use it a lot and I have over the years. One is it is industry accepted. People trust OWASP. They know that a lot of great minds come together to produce the content. And the other thing is it is community built. So if you want to use it, if you want to copy and paste from it, you can. If you want, it's a really great building block to trying to build an AppSec program in an organization. It's also extremely thorough. It really is everything soup to nuts that you would ever want to do when it comes to an application security strategy or program. It includes testing, but testing is only a component of the whole framework. So the original OAuth SAM was a little bit more antiquated to how we're developing software today. So back in the end of 2019, early 2020, they published version 2 and it added a domain. We'll talk about that a little bit, not to a great extent, but it really was a modernization. And it also emphasized concepts that were sort of glossed over in the original version, like incident management as it relates to the application security program. If you start delving down into organizations, there are some things that are just not really addressed through the application security program. Incident management is one of those things, but other things are data retention. How do we sundown applications and bring them to their end of life in a consistent way that's where we know that data has been transformed, that we're not leaving things out there? Because one of the things attackers look for when they're going out and attacking an organization or an application is they're looking for any little tidbits, right? Any kind of information that they shouldn't necessarily have, like temporary files or old backup files and things like that. So the SAM, like I say, if you haven't sort of seen it or read about it, it might be something fun for you to check out. But I wanted to talk a little bit about who I am and why am I up here talking to you all. So as Dr. Williams says, I have over 17 years in AppSec. I was a developer prior to that, and I transitioned into application security because I very much wanted my career to be in security. I had a mentor who was my CIO who actually gave me advice, and he said, if you want to go into security, he said, go into development first, because applications have to live somewhere in the network. They have to sit on a server of some sort. They have to talk to a database. There are things like, web service connections, which back then in those days were a little bit different than how we think of them now and how we use them now. But it's a little bit, it's changed quite a bit, but it was a really good, he said, you're going to learn a lot more than just, how to develop software if you do that. And it'll really set the table for you to take a career in security. So once I started into the development teams, I kept the dream alive that I wanted to move into security. And somebody approached me and said, hey, do you want to build the AppSec program here? Because we don't really have one. And so I said yes, having no idea what I was getting myself into. But it was different. You all are getting a great education that wasn't really available. We still have a workforce where most of the developers out in the world have not had formal training in how to write secure code or what application level vulnerabilities really look like. So you have a step above, the other people that are filling up most of the workforce at this point. But anyway, so I built this AppSec program that put me on the trajectory to go into consulting. And I've been in consulting over 10 years, and over 5 of them have been with GuidePoint Security. So I've seen a lot of different organizations and how they run, and the commonalities that they have and the challenges that they have within their AppSec programs. And that's really what we're going to talk about too. So why is application security still important, or why is it important at all? I love this Verizon data breach investigation report because it really illustrates it. For those who don't know, it's still number 2 in both breaches and incidents. And I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this slide. Just wanted you to see this bird's eye view if you were not aware. But when we talk about application security as it is in the world, and how your testing capabilities can really be implemented into an environment, we have to look at what is going on in application security today. And when you look back at the applications that were being written 15 plus years ago, the stack was pretty, it was pretty static. We had an app server and a database server and a web server. We didn't really have endpoints flying around all over the place. There were mobile applications that were starting to be built, but it wasn't common. There was, firmware out in the world being built in the robotic space, and some of that was happening, but it was pretty standard. A lot of people wanted a website, and they wanted the website to be able to help them do some business functionality, or they had a thick client that sat and was, on a desktop somewhere where a user could go and perform their work. But it's just very, very different. And some of the programming languages, if you look at classic ASP applications, there really aren't ways to fix the code at the code level. And that's why there are technologies out there, protection technologies like RASP and Next Gen Firewall, WAF and things like that, to help protect some of these older applications. And then we had a much more of a waterfall kind of approach to development. It could take anywhere from 6 to 12 months to have feature releases come out, because they were going to be a bulk load of feature releases. And as consumers of technology, as you all, I'm sure, are vividly aware, we want features in a much quicker rate. That has really changed the course of how developers develop software now, where they're developing very, very quickly. They're releasing sometimes many times a day, many times, if nothing else, every couple of weeks is pretty common out there in the world. They have CI/CD frame, methodologies, DevSecOps, Agile, etc. So it's a whole different world. But if you see organizations that have been around for 20 years, large companies, they are trying to support and maintain all of the above. They have these new applications, they also have the old ones, and they have everything in between. And again, the personnel who's developing these applications ranges from folks like you who've had formal education in security, and those of us who have computer science degrees but do not have that formal education. So there's a whole learning curve in the development space. And I think if you are on the track of wanting to go into the application security field, or in security field as a CISO, but having to talk to development leadership, the ability to be able to communicate in the language that they understand is still key, because a lot of what we do is building bridges and partnerships between development and security. So one of my pieces of advice to CISOs and CIOs, anybody who's wanting to launch an application security program, is that understanding the day-to-day business is super important to the success of actually establishing an AppSec program. You can't take an AppSec framework and drop it onto an SDLC. You have to find injection points into that SDLC to really find and have a successful AppSec program. And that's just unbelievably important. It's all about a grassroots kind of thing and relationship building. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple of slides. But that's really the way of the world these days, is that we're supporting a whole lot of different kinds of technologies within an application or an application portfolio. The other thing that's further exacerbated some of the complexities that we now have with all of these different endpoints and things being built on microservices and API technologies is that now we have a lot of regulatory compliance and emerging privacy laws. GDPR was kind of the first one, but we also have New York has a state law, California has a law, Brazil has a law, so there are other countries in South America, and we're going to see more and more of these laws coming out that are really it's regulatory compliance around how we're using data, having to geolocate that data. So now that we have data flying through these endpoints, we now have to understand where is it going, where is it landing, how is it being stored there, from a legal perspective. So that's further complicating what was already kind of a complex field. So again, going back and kind of looking at history and how application security kind of was birthed and came about is still important to those of you who may go into the world and become pen testers. It's really changed. When I first entered the space, most of the developers that sat around me as peers had never heard of things like cross-site scripting, cross-site request forging. Nobody was talking about then. SQL injection was still a pretty new concept. Most people would say, if you said, oh, we've got to test an application, they go, oh, we've got an SSL or we've got a firewall, we're good. You'll still, even on occasion, hear that still today. It's very rare, but it still does happen. But the common approach to AppSec was, and in those days, people really weren't welcoming of AppSec people in the room. It was kind of like, why are you here? We were here either because somebody needed to check a box or because something bad enough had happened that somebody said, hey, we need to probably think about testing something. So as the news media started, there was some company on the front page practically every week when AppSec started getting a lot of attention. There were things like TJ Maxx attacks, and you can go back and you can look at the history. But as people started hitting the front page of the New York Times and the LA Times and the Chicago Tribune, there was a lot more attention put around the importance of application security. So when organizations didn't have budget, they started finding budget dollars somewhere to at least test, if nothing else, their most mission critical applications. So if that was their front end web page that their customers would come to see, there was a lot of defacement back in those days, a lot of embarrassment because people weren't doing as much actual business online. Fast forward, we're now doing most of our business online, and COVID made that even more, serious, because I think anybody who wasn't obviously just everybody got sent home, and so they had to find a way to do business that they had never done over the internet. So at that point, though, when people started realizing, hey, we need to test something, the idea was, okay, the developer would code, an AppSec person would test something, and then everybody was trying to get to production, but they had to fix stuff. So only some things were being fixed. And then the developers would code more and we would test more. And then somebody would scramble around and they would fix whatever they could. And the technical debts has started to grow, right? So where it's just larger and larger and larger. People weren't building enough project timeline in for AppSec testing, and it was all very reactive at the end of the process. So I think as a space and as an industry, people have started to sit back and go, how do we do this differently? We have to release features more quickly. We have to develop faster. How do we test faster? Because we can't get held up in the 11th hour when it's time to go to production and get stopped, because that's just not realistic in our world anymore. Well, the other thing about it is it's super expensive. If you're testing issues at the very end of the life cycle, it's extraordinarily expensive rather than the developers fixing it right from the get-go at the very beginning of the process, or doing AppSec as sort of a more proactive endeavor. There is, for those of you who really like scientific theory, there's a Dartmouth study. Their business school put out a research paper, and it has a hypothesis and a conclusion and everything in between that actually extrapolates what this looks like and how expensive it is to fix something at the end of the process. It used to be that in order for application security and other security leadership folks to justify spending for and to justify budget dollars for their programs, they would always talk about the cost of a breach. Well, people want to think that a breach, we always want to walk the happy path. People want to think that a breach is something that's never going to happen to them. So we really need to have shifted the conversation towards the cost of remediation. Again, testing at the very end of the life cycle is just super expensive. So how do we do that? Well, going back to that software assurance maturity model, it gives us, I call it sort of the ingredients of the cookbook, whereas consultants like me and other experts in the field really give you the recipes, and we give clients the how to do this. And it's really about small steps. It's about being more proactive. As application security practitioners, we are no longer auditors. We are no longer the people who say no. We are really the people who are out mentoring and enabling developers to write secure code. So our knowledge of how we can hack these applications has become, how do we teach that to developers and give them the knowledge that they need to just be writing secure code at the very beginning of the process. So we as individuals have been injected into the earlier parts of the process as well through a lot of different mechanisms that we'll talk about, to help developers and to help that process grow and mature over time. We're still using our pen testing knowledge. We're still using our ability to successfully test software, but we're just doing it in a different way, in a great deal, in a big respect. There is still penetration testing out there. Nobody will ever tell you that that's not going to happen. That's still a very important part of the business. It's changed a little bit as far as the bulk of what we need to be doing, because the pen test at the end is really, again, putting people in that position of, oh my gosh, now we have this whole pile of stuff that we need to fix in the 11th hour. So we talk about doing this in baby steps. Again, knowing the day-to-day operations of how is my business being completed day in and day out, and that business is how we are building software, and where can we inject AppSec into that process. So I'll talk tools for just a minute as far as what we're seeing out there in the space, and what we're seeing people using, and what really amounts to a successful AppSec and a robust AppSec program. The three tools on the top are circled for a reason. Some of them are kind of considered old school. Some are, some of the fancier ones at the bottom are kind of newer technologies, but the ones across the top are really the core right now, and I'll explain why. So I typically start on the top right and move left. We'll start with dynamic application security testing. DAST tools, that was kind of the very first technology we had available to us to test applications. It was a great way, it's still a great way to see what a developed application kind of looks like in its ecosystem, and how it's performing from a security perspective. It looks at the SSL certificate, it looks at APIs, it looks at, the spider looks for all of the things that application might be redirecting to, where those domains might be out of scope. but we still can see what it's actually talking to. And then we can also find things on the server that maybe weren't intended to be there, like those backup and temporary files I missed earlier or mentioned earlier, or even hidden directories, and other folders and things. I once pen tested an application. It was a vendor developed app. They sold, it was actually to a higher education institution. They wanted cameras to record therapy sessions, and the cameras also had video. Well, and the user could log in and see those sessions. They could go tape them and see them and everything else. Well, what they didn't realize, when all the folders with all the videos and audio and still pictures were not protected by authentication. They were just sitting out there. So if you could do some directory enumeration and some fuzzing, you could actually find those video files, and they were not, and they were open to the public. So they took that down really fast. But DAST is great for doing some of that discovery. SAST, it's again static. It's just like it says, it's really to look at the code on a line by line level. There are common products or checkmarks, Veracode, Fortify. There are some others. DAST examples of that one I didn't mention are Web Inspect, Rapid7, Insight, AppSec. There are NetSparker, Acunetics. Those are some brands. Software composition analysis is super important these days. So you all are doing a lot of pen testing kind of education, but one of the biggest things that people are out there trying to wrap their arms around is outdated and vulnerable components and dependencies within the code. There are some statistics that say 80% of a modern application might be made up of these things. I call them Easter eggs. When you have a large application portfolio, and we have clients that have 7,000 applications, to find all of these little pieces and parts that might be vulnerable and outside of that organization's control is really tough unless they have a tool to help them do it. There are some other unique things that come up with software composition analysis. One is, even if your entire team is writing secure code today, if they're leveraging any of these outdated and vulnerable components, it can just decimate the AppSec posture of that application. So a totally secure application can be vulnerable with one of these things in it. There are also some other unique challenges that these create. One is, if you are scouring your code repositories with a tool like this, you can come across vulnerable components where there's no patch. So there has to be a special exception process for these situations where somebody can analyze on the security team, can we live with the risk that is introduced by this particular thing? Or do the developers really need to go back to the drawing board and find some other way to accomplish that piece of functionality that this thing provides? The other thing that you'll see is that developers oftentimes, they'll raise their hand when one of these pops up and say, oh, it's a false positive. I am actually knowingly using an outdated and vulnerable component. However, I'm not calling that piece of code where that CVE lives within that component. And there are some tools that can analyze that better than others. But examples of software composition tools include WhiteSource. Veracode has an SCA. Checkmarks has an SCA. Sneak has built their business on SCL, although they have some other things as well. So if you have the three across the board, and that's kind of common with what we're seeing, they're tried and true technologies, having a combination of all of these things is it will help organizations have a more robust AppSec program. DAST is a little bit more reactive, although the DAST vendors don't want to be called dinosaurs, so they're really finding ways to be able to integrate their tools earlier in the pipeline and in the software development lifecycle. SAST is a great way to become more proactive because we're arming the developers with tools in their IDE where they can actually go and they can test their code as they're writing it. And then SCA, again, is looking for that piece of the puzzle that's covered a little little bit by DASP. You'll see some of the more obvious like jQuery libraries and things that'll call out, but SCA really gets down to the nitty gritty. Oh, also SCA looks at the licensing of all of those components from a legal perspective. I'm an AppSec person, so I don't think about the legal perspective as much, but legal departments really love that part. So I asked RASP and NextGen WAF are three these are newer technologies. They're not as trusted. So we see less of this, of people buying these kinds of technologies right now. I don't think that that's going to be forever. But we do see a little bit less traction with some of these technologies for the most part. Generally speaking, there are, as there always will be, organizations that are sort of ahead of the game and have a different sense of comfort level with some of the newer technologies in the AppSec space. So there are exceptions to this rule for sure, but generally speaking, we're seeing more SaaS, SCA, and DAS, and then people looking at things like infrastructure as code and container scanning for some of the cloud technologies. RASP, I think one of the problems with that, several years ago, there were a lot of vendors coming into the market and they would just disappear overnight. And what was interesting, we were asked to evaluate some of these companies, and we would look at the technology and we'd look at each other and be like, this wouldn't work. It's easily bypassed. So these are a little bit careful. You kind of have to be careful. There are some companies that have had staying power. You know, Contrast is one of them. They've made the Gartner Magic Quadrant, and they've been around for a while. The problem though, and I think the reason that we're not seeing a whole lot of people adopt some of these, they are an agent that sits in production. People get nervous about stuff in production. So there's that. And then some of them are rather expensive. But what I like about a RASP, because it's actually protecting a vulnerable application out in production, is that first, when we were talking about some of those older applications, like those classic ASP applications, a RASP is a great way to put a Band-Aid until you can get that application to its end of life and replace it with something else or rewrite it in a more modernized framework that has some AppSec protections or ways for developers to code against commonly known vulnerabilities. So RASP is a great technology. I don't know where we'll see it go, but again, people get a little bit nervous about putting an agent in production because they're really afraid of blocking good traffic that might look malicious. NextGen WAF, same thing. We see a lot of people buy it, but they'll keep it in listening mode. They just get a little nervous about pulling that trigger to actually put it in blocking mode, and they tend to take a great deal of maintenance as well. So, like I say, just for your knowledge, as far as tools that you may see in the workplace. It's constantly changing. I've seen this industry, and I've seen the best in breed in these technologies change considerably over the years. And we've seen some go from best to almost worst back up to the top 2 or 3 in the space. So anyway, that's just a little highlight on technology, because I think when we're talking about that shifting left and becoming more proactive with our AppSec programs, tools and technologies are a huge part of that. You have to think about this from the perspective of real world. We as application security people are typically far outnumbered by the number of developers. So one of the things that we're also doing in the midst of trying to be more proactive around security is we are trying to expand our resources as far as possible, because there might be 1 or 2 of us with 500 developers. Even when I was building my AppSec program, we had 250 developers just in my office, and there were a whole bunch more around in my organization that I worked with in satellite offices. So one-man band is kind of the nature of things. And also because we're just so resource constrained in the industry. So people may want to hire 5 or 6 people, but can only find 1 or 2. So successful implementation of an AppSec, you heard me say this earlier, we can't be the people who say no. We're really looking for those places where we can integrate security into the processes that are already happening. And one that I think people until recently haven't really thought about, all developers across the board, they have to gather requirements. Doesn't matter what kind of development methodology they're using, they all have to use or gather requirements from somewhere. So in Agile, it might be a user story within a sprint. There are similar things in CI/CD and DevOps. There are still people developing waterfall styles, right? So we have to account for that. But we are now saying to our clients and to people out there in the world, hey, be part of that process. Go look at what those requirements look like and start injecting security coding requirements into those things. So for instance, if you see a user story where somebody's adding an input field to a form somewhere, okay, well, let's talk about authorization. Who should actually be able to access or enter data into that new field? Okay, let's talk about input sanitation, input validation. You can literally do line items, and OAuth has things in there. The ASVS will help do that, where we're saying, hey, developer, these are the things that we're going to be looking for as testers. So here's some things we want you to do. And what we do as a starting point, because again, we're dealing with a workforce that hasn't necessarily had any secure coding training, we're creating baselines. So we're saying, okay, what are the kinds of vulnerabilities that we want to eliminate from our application portfolio? How can we do that? And then that's where our starting point becomes, right? So I had a client several years ago now. They said, we are so tired of seeing cross-site scripting on every single report that GuidePoint does from your pen testing, that we've decided that we want to eliminate that particular vulnerability from our application portfolio within a year. And so we helped them. They put together a lunch and learn for their developers. They made it required training. They gave them like cheat sheets that they put out on a server somewhere, on a Confluence page or a DocuShare, whatever it was that they were using, to actually say, here are the instructions. Here are your coding snippets for how to prevent this issue. And so then by the time we got to testing, we were no longer finding. So they had absolutely eliminated that vulnerability. And then we're going to use that as onboarding for their new developers to keep that momentum at pace where they had set their goals. And then year over year, they're building on top of those requirements. So what they're doing is they're changing their organization from the ground up by literally teaching developers and arming them with the knowledge of how to eliminate vulnerabilities, so that when we come in there and we do testing at the end of the process, it's still part of what we're doing, but we're not finding as much. So again, we're bridge builders. I mean, I think, as security practitioners, forever, we've been the keeper of the secrets, right? So we're terrible about being transparent. And that's tremendously important in the world as we now know it. We have to wrap our arms around these developers, because developers are like us. They're very curious people, and the why is seriously important to them. So I have found that much more success in programs where we say, hey, we're the security team. This is what we're coming in to do. This is our plan, and this is our roadmap, and this is why we're doing it. And immediately the developers get on board. It's so important that we don't go in there with our auditor hats on. We're not there to just find criticisms in their applications. We really have to take a different approach to it of, hey, we're here to partner with you to help you build a better piece of software at the end of the day. And communication is just tremendously important, because we talk about having developers helping build self-service options for them. Like, again, those cheat sheets that I mentioned that the one client did around cross-site scripting. We should be doing those for every trending vulnerability that we're seeing in our testing. So as soon as we start doing testing, we start getting results, we should start putting together what I call an AppSec one-stop shop, but you can call it whatever you want, but basically a place where the developers know I can go out here for help and I can go out here to understand these things that are coming out of the testing. And that really gives them a way to, again, for us to expand our resources to them, where they don't have to call or email every time they have a question. They know that there's a place for them to go. The most important part about that, though, is if we build something like that for the developers that we work with, is making sure they know about it. I've seen organizations where the security teams have spent considerable amounts of time building these kinds of resources for nobody to know that they exist at all. And there couldn't be anything worse than that, right? So it's all about communication, and it's again about baby steps and finding that traction. Another thing that we do is, I like to call it an AppSec advisory board. The industry term is Security Champions Program, but again, bringing a representative of each of the siloed development groups in a room together with the security practitioners to teach them and to work on different initiatives together, like those secure coding requirement baselines, or putting some of the testing on QA teams. You'll start to see more and more that QA is taking on, that's quality assurance. If anybody's unfamiliar, I tend to speak in acronyms sometimes, as we all do in this business. The quality assurance teams are taking on more and more security testing. So say you've done a pen test and you've had a finding and the developer goes back and fixes it. Well, now we can hand that information over to quality assurance, and they can start using that as part of their regression testing, because what we want to make sure of is that your hard work doesn't get reintroduced somehow, because again, developers don't understand, so they just reintroduce the old vulnerability that somebody has gone and taken the time to fix. So there are other things like that where we can keep that momentum going by making sure that certain things are not reintroduced within the environment. So how do we help clients? And this is really where it comes down to kind of what you all are learning. So we have old world traditional services within GuidePoint. A lot of consulting companies have these, where we do AppSec pen testing. Again, like I say, pen testing is not dead at all. It's just people only have so many budget dollars to spend, and so they can't afford to pen test every single application. And if they can, it's usually just once a year. What people are really trying to do is find out ways that they can get the most bang for their buck. So how can we spend this much money that we have? We'll certainly have to pen test a few things because we have regulatory compliance telling us we have to, but how do we get more testing across the year as we're developing these things and as we go, rather than after they're already built? But again, we still have that. We still have source code reviews. That is really when we have basically, typically, I should say, somebody who was a developer for 16 years and then went into application security. They know how to find the devil in the details in that code itself. They typically will also use a SaaS tool to help enhance and speed up some of that testing to be able to cover, say, 1 million lines of code or whatever it is. Mobile assessment, mobile testing, very specialized area of application security testing. There are some real gurus out there. It takes a lot more knowledge than just testing web applications, in my opinion, because you're dealing with 2 different platforms. You're dealing with jailbroken devices. And a lot of the mobile assessments aren't about the code itself. It's about what is that mobile application doing as it sits on that phone or on that device, and how is it interacting with its environment? Can you use a fingerprint reader to authenticate? Does it store pictures? Does it access pictures? Can somebody else access the wrong pictures? Those kinds of things. SDLC gap analysis. That's when we go in and using a SAM, or there are other frameworks out there, like you may have heard of BSIM. We come in and we say, okay, we're gonna look at your SDLC, and we're going to talk to a bunch of different people around who interact with your SDLC, whether it be management, developers, security people, QA people, maybe project managers, architects. And we're going to figure out kind of where you are today. And then we're going to give you a 3 to 5 year roadmap on where you can drive to in the next few years to make your application security program better. We also do threat modeling. Threat modeling is extremely important part of the process. I didn't really touch on it a whole lot today, mostly because we're talking more from the testing perspective, but it's really about figuring out your stack and your data flows and where threats may exist in your environment. Sometimes it's done from a more proactive perspective. Other folks are doing it after a system's already been built. Not as ideal, but for some people, it's just a harder initiative to get to than some of the actual, let's test what all we have in our portfolio kind of thing. So there are a lot of people out there kind of looking more into doing more threat modeling, which is fabulous. Threat modeling has really changed a lot. I think years ago, people kind of thought about it as a tabletop exercise, and it would, the document or whatever artifact we got out of it would sort of go in file 13, never be revisited again. Whereas now we're really trying to bring threat modeling into 2021 to say, hey, this should be a living document and a living artifact that's used to make educated decisions throughout the lifespan of a particular application. Here are the threats, here are the data flows, here are the kinds of data that we have going through this. It helps a lot with some of that regulatory compliance and those privacy laws we talked about earlier. And then architecture reviews. Architecture reviews are a little bit different when it comes to the AppSec world than what people, I think, in a network think of an architecture design. Architecture reviews are really looking at that application from a bit different perspective. Usually we'll talk about authentication and authorization, input validation, but it also talks about the treatment plan. What are we subjecting this application to? Is it internal testing, internal manual testing, tools being tested? How often? Are there third parties that come in and assess this application? What is the disaster recovery plan for this particular application? Is it part of the incident response planning and teams? So those are the kinds of things that we look at with architecture reviews. As far as and I was going to talk about reporting, because all of those things on that previous slide involve a report at the end, right? And because you all are in software testing, I wanted to touch a bit on reporting. So there was a really popular security conference called DerbyCon for several years, and the last one was a couple, I don't know, maybe 3 years ago, sadly. But a few DerbyCons in, there were a lot of some of the best people in the security industry that all came and did talks about how terrible our industry is at reporting. So I thought it would be a good opportunity to talk to a class like this about that particular subject. Reporting is so important. It's absolutely, if you are a pen tester or doing any of the other things on the previous slide, like mobile assessments or source code reviews, reporting is key. And what I mean by that is it really shouldn't be, hey, look at how great I tested and look at how great my results were. And look, I found all these really sort of sexy vulnerabilities, if you will. It's not very useful if that's the extent of it. Reporting, it should be arming the recipient of the report with every piece of information that they need to understand why the issue is important or not so much, what it is, how to fix it, how to replicate it. And then it should provide some extra resources like links to OAuth, for instance. If we are doing that, the best report when we do a report review comes back with no questions, because even if a developer or a network engineer sits down and looks at that, if they have every piece of information that they need to go, not just understand it and replicate it, but also to fix it, we've done our job well. So it's super, super important. Otherwise, what's the point of the exercise? If nobody knows how to fix it and nobody really understands why it's important, and nobody understands why they should care, they probably won't care. And that thing will probably sit out there in that environment vulnerable until such time as somebody can come and talk to them in a way that they go, oh, we get it. We need to fix this. So I just wanted to harp on that little soapbox for a minute, because it's something that even no matter where you go, if you continue doing this for a living and you see bad reporting, that's an opportunity to maybe fix it. I also wanted to talk a little bit about, I'm sure, and this may be preaching to the choir for you all, but as you're more, I'm certainly aware of, the OAuth Top 10 gets revised every 4 years. This year's is really, really interesting. Fortunately, it's in draft form. I will say fortunately, because I think there are a lot of organizations out there that are trying to wrap our heads around how we now implement this, because as you can see, insecure design is a category of findings. So it's going to be really interesting to see how this changes our culture as well, because in the past, I would say for the most part, generally speaking, to produce that caveat, the OAuth Top 10 has really been about pen testing findings. It's been about things that you would find through a pen test. And now it incorporates other things, because I think that also speaks to the direction our industry has taken of, it's not all just about pen testing, it's about other things. It's about building robust software at the end of the day. So I'm not sure if you all have studied this or have evaluated it, but okay, I'm seeing nods from Dr. Williams. So I'd be interested to hear you all's opinions about all of this. But like I say, fortunately it's still in draft. I can't remember exactly when we're supposed to get a finalized copy of it. But it has been rather eye-opening and really interesting for so many of us in the industry. So I just wanted to touch on that for a minute. So, some of this I've already said. I have to talk about what I'm doing. So when I first got to GuidePoint a little bit, I was over that pen testing team and the folks that did all of those things on that other slide. And a few years ago, we had clients starting to come to us saying, hey, we're super resource constrained. We either don't have AppSec people, and so we have these wonderful people on our security teams, but none of them really understand development speak. And so we have this disconnect between development and security. And we know we need tools, but we don't understand what's coming out of them. And we don't know how to help our developers. We had other clients coming to us saying, hey, we're really resource constrained. We have AppSec people, but we just don't have enough of them. But all of them were coming and saying, how can you help us? Well, we didn't really have a way to do staff aug. Staff augmentation is extremely expensive in the consulting world. And so it's not very sustainable for most organizations to hire somebody at these very high consulting rates in a staff aug kind of way. So we were seeing this change in the market, and I thought this is kind of where I think that the market's going and where the world is going. As you've heard me say, pen testing is not dead. However, people are trying to get more bang for their buck out of the money that they can spend on application security in general. So I left that group to go out and build what we're calling AppSec as a service. And what we did is we've come up with a way to do a managed service that's application security based. So what that looks like is we basically have these ways that we can understand what is the client really needing help with, about what kind of time commitment does that look like on a monthly basis. And then we're there as just another member of their team. It's not a traditional managed service for a couple of reasons. One is most managed services, your request goes into a queue, somebody anonymously, whoever's free, answers that request to that client. with my team, it's dedicated resources. We want to feel like just another member of that client's team. Additionally, there's no engine under our managed service. We want our clients to own their own tools, to own their own products, and to own their own data. So we basically come into their environment more, it feels like staff aug, but it's just more of a managed service because they're not necessarily paying for us to be there all day, every day. And so it's really been interesting. We've gotten a lot of traction. It's been a very successful offering, and and it's kind of opened up this whole new world of doing business as AppSec practitioners out there in the world. So the pen testing skills are extremely important. Most of the team has a great deal of experience in pen testing and software testing. We put those skills to use. We just are doing it differently. We're doing it more in all the ways I've talked about along the way of finding those injection points, helping them establish secure coding requirements, giving them governance, giving them the exception process to be able to handle the findings that are coming out of those software composition analysis tools. We might be helping them build and maintain their security champions programs. We're certainly taking the output of the tools that they have, whether it be SAS, DAST, or SCA, helping prioritize those findings, helping validate whether the findings are false positives or not. We're also doing things like remediation verification. I mean, even though tools are being leveraged and automation and integration of tools into these pipelines is becoming a really important part of this faster paced lifestyle, there's still a need to understand, hey, just as an example, cross-site scripting. Developer doesn't understand it, they blacklisted script tags. That might trick a tool, but it's not going to trick my team, right? We can go in there and say, yeah, this is partially remediated because you fixed it this way, but it's not fully fixed. We can bypass it and still execute that particular finding. So we're doing a lot of things like that, and it's really an interesting way of helping people out there in the world expand their ability to do application security. So a little recap again. As you go out there in the world, it's super important to understand the business of building secure software in order to understand how to implement security properly. And just remember, we're always educators and mentors, not necessarily those auditors. There are auditors out there, and that's just not us. And that really the basis of shifting left is all about developer enablement, and that is really, really the key to the success of an AppSec program. So I'm hoping that this was valuable and that you got something out of it. And I'd love to take any questions. We're happy to have any conversation you'd like.
Do any of the students have questions?
Hello. So my name is Aditya, and it was like very interesting presentation. So what are the actually, is there any kind of tools that can actually assess the business, like which kind of framework will directly fit into which kind of business?
I think as far as most of the frameworks will apply to just about any business. Like I said, my preferred framework is SAM, just because it's open to the public. As far as business tools specifically, I think we're probably going to see more of that. But I think for me, when I talk a lot to clients and prospective clients about what kind of tools they may procure, and it's really, I think it takes some experience and really knowledge about the different kinds of tools and what they're good at and what they're not so good at. So, if I have let's just say, for instance, I have a client coming to me that they're starting from ground zero. They really don't have an AppSec program of any kind. And let's say they have one person who has some sort of skill set when it comes to AppSec. A DAST might be a good way for them to start. It depends. And if they have budget, it might be that a SaaS might be a better way for them to start, because they can really, they have the money to actually implement a tool into the developer's pipeline. But there are some, and we didn't talk about this a whole lot, but there are definitely some do's and don'ts around not only helping clients choose which technologies might work best for them as they're evolving their AppSec programs, but how to implement those. For instance, the last thing that we want to do is push a tool like a SaaS tool into a development pipeline before we've really vetted it and fine-tuned it and introduced it and gotten the developers acclimated. Because what ends up happening, they will feel like it's a burden. And if there are false positives that it's reporting, which many SaaS will do if they're unconfigured and haven't been fine-tuned, is they will get road weary very quickly of all the noise that's coming at them that's unnecessary. So there's a whole cultural conversation around the implementation of those kinds of tools as well. Does that address your question?
So what I can think is, like, most of the companies, they first have some other roles that evaluate what is the need, right? And based on that, like, they consult with AppSec program, and then they decide like which kind of tool they are going to incorporate in their company. So it's not that like all of the companies have the same tools, but like according to their business, they will have like different tools, but they will be there, right?
Right. And so we ask a lot of questions and we make recommendations based on what their answers are. And typically we'll drive them to a couple of options to look at. And we'll say, this is what we're thinking based on your business, and this is why. And so we do here at GuidePoint, we help them evaluate different kinds of tools, and we help them make those recommendations.
Right. Thank you.
Do any other students have questions? Well, I've got a couple.
Okay.
Yes. What knowledge or skills should a person have if they want to succeed in the cybersecurity testing area?
So I think my answer might be a little surprising, but soft skills are super important. Technology and technical ability can be learned, but having the ability to communicate what you're seeing and all of that technical stuff in ways that people can understand, because you'll find in security, you're having to talk to executives as well as the people down in the weeds that are the technical people doing the actual work. You have to sort of switch your language to both of those people. I have seen really, really super smart technical people that don't do very well in this business because they cannot explain what's in their head or what their findings are well enough to where somebody gets it. And so their value is completely lost. So communication skills, writing skills, those are really, really important in this business, 100%.
Yes, I often tell my students it's more important to be able to write in English than it is to write in Java.
Yes.
Okay, if you could tell corporate CIOs something so that everybody would hear it, what would you tell them?
So I come at most things like that from an AppSec perspective, but I make a, it's a joke, but it's not a joke, about the fact that Rome wasn't built in a day, and neither was an AppSec program. I think CIOs and CISOs many times back burner the AppSec program because it's complex. There's so many moving, it's a whole world unto itself, and I think it just makes them, it stresses them out, I think, a little bit. And so I like to remind them that, when auditors come in, they're not looking for perfection, they're looking for improvement. And it's when you start looking at the SAM, it becomes this overwhelming to-do list of things, right? And I think that it's taking priorities. If you try to bite off more than you can chew, you'll fail. So it's really, baby steps are so key to doing this, and just slowing it down. That's my biggest thing, I think, that I tell those C-level executives.
Okay, thank you. I don't have any more questions. Do others have questions? I guess not. Well, thank you very much. Yes, at this point we'd applaud or something, but that means my right hand would have to touch my left hand, and I don't know if that's a secure action in these pandemic days. But here, let me just switch back to.
Oh, let me stop sharing. Oh, that'll help.
Okay, I think hopefully everybody can see my slides.
No.
No, we're
No.
seeing you.
No, oh, oh, heaven forbid, you don't want to see me. That's about the worst of all possible solutions. Oh, okay. Let me see here. Where is my? Okay. Well, how interesting. My yes, where did my stuff go? All right. Yes. Maybe. Are you still sharing your screen, Ms. Bell?
I am not. I had stopped.
Okay.
So we should be good there.
Okay. What do you see now? Do you see my slides?
Create 4 exam questions.
All right. Okay. And not the applicant. Well, okay. Regardless of what you see. Yes, I remind the students that there's a assignment due tomorrow at noon. You have like 21 hours left, 20 hours left to get it done. So don't wait to the last minute. And of course, it's just 4 questions that might appear on the exam. And if I like your question, it may appear on the exam, and hopefully you know the answer to your question. You're kind of an idiot if you send me a question, you don't know the answer to it. But they have to be good questions. Good is important. You're not going to get 100 on this assignment if you send me miserable questions. And I point to Bloom's taxonomy, for which I provide a link in the in Blackboard in the assignment. Something at the application level or above. Memorization questions is just not appropriate for a graduate exam. Remember, this is an open book exam. If you can Google up the answer in 15 seconds, and it's just not a good question. I remind you that this is not an easy assignment. Yes, a good question is hard to come up with. It has to be somewhere between trivial and impossible. That's a fine line usually. It relates to the issues we've discussed. You cannot ask questions about something we haven't covered in the class, and try to make it something that doesn't require memorization. Okay. Unless anybody has any further questions, I think we're done for today.
I did, Dr. Williams, I put my LinkedIn, I meant to do this earlier. I put my LinkedIn into the chat. So please connect with me. I do mentoring, and thank you all so much for having me.
Okay. Thank you. Yes. Thank you very much for coming. I will be